Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview, is my upcoming memoir. It's my early life story wrapped around what tragically turned out to be John's last day on the planet, which I was unbelievably able to spend a good part of with him and Yoko. And this is my first introductory chapter, Imagine My Lead Up to Lennon. On December 8th, 1980, I was overflowing with excitement, anticipation, and disbelief as I approached the Dakota Apartments on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I was there to play my part in John Lennon's one and only U.S. radio interview following the release of his and Yoko Ono's brand new latest album, Double Fantasy. And the voices in my head were telling me that this was without a doubt about to become the best day of my life that I could ever even begin to imagine, and that I was truly the luckiest person on the planet. Visions of thousands of screaming Beatles fans packed into Dodger Stadium so many years earlier swirled through my brain like milkshake in a blender, and I could barely keep myself from swaggering down the sidewalk as my associates and I approached the security booth right outside the Dakota's entrance. I'd flown out one day earlier from the West Coast as part of our 3-member RKO radio team, along with an executive from Warner Brothers Geffen Records. And although our RKO trio had already been working together on a number of attention-getting network radio rock specials and interviews over the past few years, including heading off to London just the year before to hang out with Paul McCartney and Wings, this would be an entirely different ballgame altogether. After all, we were on the verge of meeting up with someone who'd literally disappeared from the music business for the previous 5 years, John Lennon. John had been hunkered down in the role of ultra-happy house husband and attentive father ever since his 18-month-long lost weekend, the time during which he was self-admittedly miserably separated from Yoko and living in Los Angeles, and he hadn't recorded or released any new music in at least the 5 years since. But now Double Fantasy, the new album created with his often critically reviled wife Yoko Ono, was his way of opening the door to the 80s and a whole new era. No one else in the world could even begin to imagine how it felt to realize that we were about to become the only American radio gang chosen to help John and Yoko usher that era in. The build-up to our interview had already been somewhat mind-blowing. At one point, while everything was still in the early planning stages, I remember getting a call from someone asking the date, year, and time of my birth, because apparently Yoko was working with her personal astrologer, who was going to take all the information collected and then use it to put together an astrological chart, which would then determine the best possible day for our Dakota meetup to take place. Of course, the surprising thing is that even with all that intimate information, and despite the fact that John and Yoko had already planned to head to Hawaii and the West Coast during that same time period, somehow Monday, December 8th, 1980, a date that will forever live in freakish rock and roll infamy, was chosen. Our flight to the Big Apple alone had been a total trip, with celebrities like British actor Anthony Hopkins and heavyweight champion Ken Norton also on board. Although I barely had the opportunity to say hello to Hopkins, who'd just starred in the amazing recently released film Elephant Man, I was incredibly excited to meet Ken Norton. Standing next to the massive boxer as he towered over me seemed to put my whole life in perspective. And when we shook hands, I remember thinking how it felt like my digits were being enveloped by a huge Hormel ham. My main goal on that flight to New York was to come up with an amazing list of questions for John and Yoko. We'd been warned well in advance that asking about John's time with the Beatles was a definite no-no. So as I wrote out my thoughts regarding their recording process and inspiration behind the various songs on Double Fantasy, I also shuffled through the Playboy magazine interview with Lennon that had just hit the newsstands. And with each page, I became more and more convinced that I was about to be torn to shreds by my idol. It seemed to me that John had not only been adamant while talking to the writer about not wanting to bring up the Beatles, but his past in general. And I began to get the scary feeling that we were all about to be slammed by his superior intellect and wit. Knowing also that his personality was notoriously complex, the last thing I wanted was for him to think that I was some foolish, young, undereducated fangirl who still saw him as the smart Beatle, while letting stupid questions with obvious answers pour from my mouth. Fortunately, I was able to get over at least some of my insecurities. So by the time the four of us from RKO and the record company were all sitting up together as though we were having a slumber party that night before the interview in one of our rooms at the Plaza Hotel, drinking hot chocolate and savoring the moment as we nailed down the last-minute details, I saw myself as more than ready. Staying at the Plaza was especially exciting and coincidental, considering that nearly 17 years before, that's where Beatles manager Brian Epstein had booked himself and the band for their very first U.S. hotel stay, arriving at New York's Kennedy Airport just a couple days prior to their debut appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. While we waited in John and Yoko's outer office the next day for our interview to get underway, their assistants filled us in on what the couple had been up to so far that morning, letting us know that they were just finishing up with photographer Annie Leibovitz from Rolling Stone magazine. Leibovitz had spent the last couple of hours upstairs with them snapping pictures, including what would become the most iconic shot ever of the famous couple, a naked John Lennon curled up on the carpet in a fetal position, wrapped around a fully clothed Yoko Ono, which basically defined the very nature of their relationship. I'd actually had my own encounter, more like a run-in, with Annie Leibovitz just a couple of years before in Seattle. As a news radio anchor reporter at King AM, the major top 40 station in town at the time, I'd been begged by a local publicist to attend the famous photographer's University of Washington show opening and then do a quick interview with her about it that would air as part of my newscast the next day. Even though I had to be at work before 5 o'clock the next morning, I sat in the audience that night throughout Annie's lengthy entire lecture and then approached her afterwards. But instead of being appreciative and accommodating, Leibovitz loudly accused me of lying through my teeth, asking why in the world anyone would book a radio interview with a photographer. I was mortified, and I got away from her as fast as I could. Despite my initial reaction so many months later, when I learned that Annie Leibovitz was working right upstairs with John and Yoko, I was certainly not about to let the possibility of running into her at the Dakota dampen my spirits in the least. No worries, though. Fortunately, I was never forced to encounter that photographer again. Our team was ushered into an incredible room which turned out to be Yoko's and to a lesser extent John's private office, so we could set up for the interview while we continued to wait. The first thing I noticed was the fluffy white wall-to-wall shag carpeting, which also made me wish I was barefoot. And of course we were all asked to take our shoes off before entering and stepping on it. The next thing that caught my eye was this spectacular, super long, glass-topped coffee table framed in metal, with serpents winding their way up and around each one of the legs. As I looked at these man-made snakes through the glass off and on during the entire interview, I remember having this surreal feeling of, am I really here with John and Yoko? No doubt about it, I was living a dream, and more than just a tiny bit scared that I'd suddenly wake up to find out I was imagining the whole thing. RKO engineer-producer Ron Hummel was busy taking out his tape deck and other equipment just as Yoko joined us, introducing herself and seemingly very happy to see me, a female, as part of our otherwise all-male team. I felt a connection right off the bat, not just because we were both women, but because I'd always been intrigued by her avant-garde approach to art and music, even if I didn't actually understand the meaning of her conceptual art and music, especially her early experimental music. But I was inspired by the way she'd never backed down, even while becoming a controversial figure blamed by 99% of the rock, pop music-loving public for breaking up the Beatles. In other words, I was in awe. And so our pre-interview kicked off with Yoko telling us that John was finishing up with Annie Leibovitz and would be down shortly. While waiting for Ron to mic her up, I whipped out the silly little mechanical wind-up toy I picked up in San Francisco's Chinatown, a fire-breathing dragon that I thought Sean, their 5-year-old son, would have a lot of fun with. Yoko was sure that John himself would absolutely fall in love with it, and she was totally right on. When John spotted it later, he immediately grabbed it and wound it up, watching the dragon travel the entire length of the glass coffee table, while the two of them laughed like crazy, both he and Yoko saying how much John would enjoy it. That is, if they ever actually gave it to him, rather than keeping it to play with themselves. Another item I'd brought along with me was my personal copy of Grapefruit, a 1970 edition of Yoko's 64 conceptual art and poetry book, featuring, as it said right under her glowing portrait on the cover, works and drawings by Yoko Ono, and introduction by John Lennon. I'd picked up the book years before on the bargain table of Cody's, Berkeley's infamous Telegraph Avenue bookstore, never imagining that I'd be sitting with the author herself a mere 4 years later, waiting for her former Beatle husband to join us. Once Ron had Yoko's microphone in place, the two of us gals chatted on tape about the relationship between men and women in society and the pressing need to open up a new dialogue between the sexes. Dave Sholin, the RKO executive who'd made sure I was included in the interview in the first place and was naturally just as thrilled as I was to be there, joined in, as did Warner Brothers record exec Bert Keane, who'd been instrumental in pulling the whole event together. And so there we were, the four of us plus Yoko, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. As it opened slightly, just a couple of inches, the first thing I saw was John's characteristic round glasses and his nose sticking through the crack. When he opened the door up all the way, I turned towards him and in my typical smart-ass fashion, looked right at him and asked under my breath, "Can't you see we're in the middle of an interview?" He looked at me and laughed out loud. And when Yoko did too, I thought to myself, everything's okay. We're going to have a good time here. John introduced himself to our group and then sat down right next to me on the small love seat to join in on the conversation. My brain began to explode. Me, sitting next to John Lennon. Unfreaking believable. How in the world this could ever happen was totally beyond my comprehension. And as I made my best effort to stay in the moment, I realized that this interview could very well be the milestone event that would not only define the rest of my career, but no doubt my entire life. I had no way of knowing at the time that this was to become John Lennon's final interview, mere hours before he was tragically shot and killed just outside this same building later that very evening. While countless books and bios have been published since on the life and times of John Lennon, none of those other authors spent that ill-fated day with John and Yoko, nor were any of them confronted later on and literally forced into a conversation like I was with the beyond creepy character who was about to become his assassin. This repulsively annoying reject stepped right in my path as I walked from the Dakota hours later, repeatedly asking me, "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph?" Over and over and over. For years I've beat myself up about this, wondering why didn't I realize there was something seriously off about him? And even more importantly, why didn't I sense that he was at that very moment carrying the gun that he would use to murder John Lennon before the night was over? The guilt has been hanging heavily over my head for more than 40 years. To my mind, this is what makes me, Laurie Kaye, the right person to tell her singular story as the half-century anniversary of the tragic event that affected so many lives, including my very own, approaches. As a young rock radio reporter, writer, producer, sitting at the Dakota that day with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, it turns out I guessed right about the life-altering nature of our interview. But what I couldn't even begin to imagine was that this unparalleled episode would not only dramatically change the course of my life and career, but my psyche as well. To this day, whenever I mention interviewing John Lennon on the former Beatles' last day on the planet, the response is nearly always the same. Jaws drop, people gasp, and the inevitable question is asked, "When are you going to write your book, Laurie?" The answer is now. Thank you.